Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 170. Today we're talking about performance testing tools for your front ends. We are your hosts this week, Justin Brow, Danny Blue, Leon Revel. Danny, Leon, good to see you.
Hey.
I'm doing a podcast.
Podcasting, the latest craze.
Although, it's not going to be long until we're on 200, so it's not, not a new craze.
That's true. We were hip before it was cool to be hip. Is it hip? I don't really know. I think they give you a podcast now if you just walk into certain stores, like they just hand you, here's your topic and this is your thing. But we have a particular topic. We're talking about the web. And to learn about what's going on the web this week, we're going to throw over to Leon, who's going to talk about this week in the web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thanks, Justin. So first of all, Babel 7 has just been released, which has been in the making for 2 years, which obviously means that it's full of loads of new features and fixes. So please go and check out the release post for all of the details. Lit HTML 0.11.0 has just been released, which includes a whole host of new features, changes, and bug fixes. So again, check out the release notes to find all of the details for that. The Devices and Sensors Working Group have just published a first public working draft of the geolocation sensor, which is a spec that defines the geolocation sensor interface for obtaining geolocation for the hosting device. So that sounds very exciting. And there's been a collection of links which provide a visual explanation of some JavaScript concepts collated and published on GitHub. So if visual aids make it easy for you to understand complex concepts, etc., then I really recommend you go and check that out. I quite like the look of some of those links in there. And this last one is completely mental. So somebody's got Windows 2000 running in the browser using WebAssembly, which is mad in itself. But then the fact that you can use that operating system in Chrome and then run Firefox in that operating system to browse the web, it just blows my mind. So that's really interesting. So please go and check that out and have a play around with it. And that's everything from me for this week in web.
Thank you, Leon. Yeah, the Windows 2000 thing. I saw also the Windows 95 one, which also made me chuckle.
Yeah.
If only because it truly is quite amazing the amount of things that you can do with WebAssembly, and then the amount of things you can find a good reason to buy more cores for. So if you're wondering, hey, why do I need more cores and more RAM? Now you have reasons, as if you needed. I mean, I guess you have to have something on that requisition form. So
eventually we're going to be able to go multiple levels deep with this stuff, right? You'll be able to go to your browser, load up an operating system, load up another browser, which then loads up another operating system.
It is Inception. I think you got to, if you go 4 deep at that point, you're pretty much done. That's what the movie taught me, Danny.
Excellent.
So speaking of levels deep, on what dream state we're in, today we're kind of talking about the notion of performance testing when it comes to the front end. And the front end, these days, there's a lot of conversations around, oh, my site is very large, and oh, I must, bundle and split and do all these things. But those actually have some outcome, which is actually the performance of the thing you're building, which a lot of folks don't necessarily test for. Maybe that's because they don't know what's out there. Maybe that's because they haven't worked it into their workflow. So this week we're kind of talking about performance testing and things. How should we dive into this, gentlemen? How should we start the magical thing?
First of all, if we can just try and categorize performance testing, obviously there's loads of different different categories of performance testing. Specifically, what are we talking about today is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, performance testing is quite a wide range of things, because when you start to think about what makes your website run, it is a bit of a rabbit hole of technologies, isn't it? We have the notion of how much script that browser is going to run, the very JavaScript that powers so many of our web applications today. But you also have to deliver it, and all of a sudden, then you're looking for, what's my time to first byte? What's my how fast is my pre-connects running for that thing? So it's quite a wide span. So today I think we just talk about, what kind of tools can we use that as a web developer might help us on that front side. And there's quite a few tools out there. We've got things like webpagetest.org. There are tools like Lighthouse now. There are linters like WebHint, which was previously Sonar from the Microsoft folks. And then you've got stacks of tools that sort of monitor all these sort of things for you. Things like GTmetrix and site speed, IO, amongst a whole cauldron of them. So we're going to try to focus on the things that are, as far as I'm concerned, the lowest hanging fruit of those things. Your Lighthouses, web page tests, and the web hints of the world to say, hey, what are these things and how do they sort of, help us understand our browser sort of world?
I suppose another kind of good follow-up question is, why should anybody care? Why is this important? And there's lots of very obvious ones, but it might be a good place to just go through a few of those.
So the web has gotten bigger overall, right? As we know this, we're shipping more things down the wire. And that has an overall cost, not just from I have to deliver it standpoint, but to an end user. So when we sit there and we sort of reconcile performance, we're reconciling the fact that we want our users' experiences to be better, that low friction variant that the web offers us is not limited to a subset of people with the latest, greatest hardware or the latest, greatest, XYZ LTE connections of things. Because a lot of times we get stuck in the loop as developers of, I have this thing, and I know we've probably all said it at one time or another, it works for me. And when it comes to performance, that doesn't really work, right? We have a pretty large cauldron of different devices. When you start to go into sort of the next billion devices, when you start to look overseas, sort of Africa develops and connectivity improves, and you're roaming around in the world. All of a sudden, now that bundle that looked so crisp and clean on your desktop with your USB connected handheld as you're testing doesn't look so great. All of a sudden, now we've got performance problems. Now all of a sudden,
developers tend to obviously have pretty fast machines to do all the stuff that we need to do, like as you always compiling certain versions of Chrome, etc. And that's just not real world usage.
Exactly. We're not developers, while users themselves are not necessarily the typical user. We don't we have a tendency to work around the issues we have, and then sometimes you throw a desk through a window because you can't work around those issues, right? Even with the hardware you have or the things that are inherently there. And when we talk about performance in the browser, this varies so much, and there are just certain things that you're trying to control a very wide span of stuff, and to control it, you got to be able to measure it. And when we talk about sort of performance testing on the front end and what that means, ideally we're trying to measure, the certain aspects of the way our applications perform. So the tooling we talk about a lot, your webpagetest.orgs of the world, it does a lot to do that for us, right? We can sit there and run webpagetest.org and say, hey, I want to browse in this different location. I want to be on some specific type of device. I don't want full speed connectivity. I want something that is inherent that the world might see, which is probably, maybe it's 3G, maybe that's 3G slow, maybe that's, some variant of it where you're really testing the outer edges to see just exactly, is my bundle performing? Am I getting to that point where, my script isn't sucking down their world? We have to be cognizant of the amount of bytes we send now. Beforehand, it wasn't necessarily this way. We didn't really track these things. And you start to look at the amount of size bundling and everything else that goes through, and all of a sudden oh, wow, things are getting bigger, but connectivity is not necessarily growing. While connectivity is growing, the speed of which that connectivity grows and the speed of those devices doesn't necessarily keep up.
So you specifically mentioned web page test there. So could you maybe describe actually how that works and how that compares to real world usage? Obviously the whole point is to test how your web applications are going to execute in the real world. How close is it to with web page test, and how does it achieve that?
Web page test does quite a few things. Web page test at the moment is probably, I think, about as good as you can get, particularly because of the network layer that web page test has. So it's going to give you a pretty resounding sort of good network condition test, particularly for assets going down into that browser. From a sort of testing comparison standpoint, web page test is really going to give you the nature of the way that thing and that waterfall sort of operates. So one of the things you can use it for is to actually visualize exactly, you can capture video and say, hey, show me my page rendering on a target style device. So if you really want to see exactly sort of how that's operating against, say, sort of the default test device, or at least the one I use locally as well as on web page test, is like a Moto G, particularly a Gen 4. That's a sort of mid-tier device, a little lower on the lower side of scale things that just sort of pans out. Like, it's a good test device to use. They're fairly inexpensive, but you can also use it in web page test and you get an exact rendering of what that thing looks like. Because again, we don't want to be stuck necessarily in pure sort of emulation. Like, a lot of times we emulate things and we think, oh, that's good enough, but we want that real world performance, that characteristic of that thing, because otherwise we're consistently emulating certain things. So an example of that is in sort of Lighthouse, right? We're going to emulate the conditions of that device as best we can, as opposed to actually having the device, though you can run Lighthouse on the actual device too.
And you can also, looking at web page tests, choose the various different locations to execute those tests from. So obviously that's going to take latency into account and those kind of things. Yeah.
So you definitely get a pretty clean representation. And the nice thing about web page test too is that you're not, some tools are very prone to being attached to things that Chrome has. So where you're really getting into the nitty gritty of the way CDP or Chrome's developer DevTools protocol works. The things that Puppeteer and your Lighthouses and a lot of your other sort of performance tools are built on top of. But in web page test sort of land, like, you can run a G4 not just against Chrome, but just against pretty much anything you want. Everything from Firefox to they even have UC browser on there now. So if you're getting ready to test in China, you can test to see, oh, hey, good, I want to see how this actually performs within UC. So you definitely get a better variation of the amount of things that you could test against. And web page test has a massive amount of documentation in terms of stuff. Obviously, you can host your own testing location if you really want to dive into it. There's a lot of things, a lot of existing interfaces that you can obviously automate within web page test. And it's a really good sort of indicator of it's a good place to start. You can really get into the nitty gritty of, hey, just what kind of metrics am I seeing there? Whether it's your first bytes, your start renders, the notion of calculated speed index, in terms of user visible content, which is very important, right? We want to give something for the user to see. And it's sort of the tool. If you haven't used it, I definitely recommend it. Like, you should be using web page test to test all the things.
So how does that kind of fit in with some of the other tools? Does that do everything that you'd possibly need, and therefore it's not really worth considering any other tools? Or is there some of the other tools, which I'm sure we'll get onto now, do they fill some of the gaps that web page test doesn't provide solutions for?
I think when you start to look at the tools that you have available to you, everything does a little bit more or a little bit less depending on what you're really trying to get out of it. So web page test is great for testing a real world sort of networky test. Like, that's the kind of way I use it, to really find out the measurement of network activity and things that are triggered by JavaScript behind it and grabbing things and whatnot. So it's really good for that, to find your start renders and your speed indexes. But other tools sort of do that as well, sort of on their emulated layer. I like web page test for that. when you start to look at things like Lighthouse says, well, I want to go a layer deeper and actually pull additional metrics out of that. So the amount of time a script renders up, and this uses more of the sort of additional APIs that sort of sit behind the background in that browser to sort of give you the additional sort of what that impact is for the way scripts run and the way interactivity is where a browser has.
So is
it does
it safe to say that Lighthouse would be something that would make it easier for you to identify some of the reasons why a particular part of the application is running slow, as opposed to more of the user whole user experience?
It's going to give you a more whole user experience thing. You can dive down into sort of the metrics of it to find those things. But again, if you wanted to, if you looked at your Lighthouse sort of metrics, and I'm not even talking about the actual numbered scores, because Lighthouse will give you scores, and you can use Lighthouse in DevTools. Like, you don't have to run it on the CLI. You can integrate it in places to get other things, and I've written scripts around it. Like, you can integrate Lighthouse as a node module into your tests. So if you're writing Mocha or other style tests, like, you can do. You can actually say, oh, I'm going to run Lighthouse test and get a really particular score to make sure something happens. Or I'm going to write a Lighthouse test to make sure that the audit it uses to verify that my service worker is built is actually there. So you can do all those things using not just the actual tool, but actually the library itself. So you can write additional tooling around it to meet your needs. So I find that useful for most folks who have really particular wants and needs out of everything, because otherwise sometimes people get overwhelmed with the sheer amount of data that tooling will provide back. So you can, optimize down to the things that you're trying to particularly impact. So the nice thing though is that if you're looking at those numbers and going, I really want to dive into it, that's when you sort of go into DevTools. DevTools in Chrome, DevTools in Firefox, DevTools in Edge, and or even Safari for that matter. But at that point, you can start to run tracing to really get down on what your flame graph is. Say, oh, well, I do see that this script, takes 7 seconds of, CPU to spin up. That's a really long time. That's terrible. And then you can look at that flame graph and go, well, I wonder what, why is it doing this? Have I missplit it? Have I sort of misinformed? Like, what is my code doing that maybe it should not do? Or maybe I should offload some of these tasks, or maybe I should load those tasks all at once. You can really start to dig down into the trace. So that's the performance tab that I spend a lot of time in the performance tab. And there's a lot of things that that you can dive into the performance tab for. But
I'd be
the tooling on top is a little easier to start with.
I'd be interested to know how you kind of fit this in with your general development flow, or kind of what part of the project do you start doing this stuff, and how do you do this kind of stuff day to day in your everyday projects?
It's going to vary based on project.
It depends, of course.
Sure, yeah. It always depends, but really, from a performance standpoint, it's, if you've got an existing CI, like, there's a lot of things you can do at the CI level that'll just check these things for you. Now, that's not as necessarily as easy as we'd all like it to be at this point, regardless of what tool you decide to use, or exactly what you're trying to vet, so that if you're making, if you're doing typical pull request style stuff in, whatever type of repo you have, ideally, before things are merged down, that the performance implication of that change would be within an existing code base. From a start code base, though, it's really your purpley pattern sort of stuff. Like, if which we've talked on the show about before, in terms of Polymer, but purple's really just purple's not really Polymer specific. Purple, a lot of people think when they hear the word purple, it's Polymer specific, but really it's just a way of structuring code and things and resources to run, be it progressive web app or not. And the notion of, you want to push your render. Sorry, I should define it. Push critical resources, render your view, initial view, pre-cache anything else that's remaining, and then lazy load things that you need on demand. So a lot of times from an application standpoint where you have particular views in JavaScript, this is somewhat easy to do because you can break it up. If you're working on components, ideally they're decoupled and you can, sort of live in that component. So in this case, it becomes somewhat easier. You can test and verify components of your particular application to make sure that they're performant. You can test them individually at that point. And a lot of times from a component standpoint, regardless of what type of component it is, just some notion of what that component is for your insert framework here. Like you can verify, am I doing things performantly just by tracing that particular thing. From an application perspective, though, you really have to work in the what is this overarching thing for my lib going to do? Am I doing a whole bunch of work on the main thread that could be pushed off to a web worker? Like that's, and that's goes beyond even the test tooling, because a lot of times people in the code review phase don't do that upfront work. They just say, okay, this looks okay. But you really should, you have to sort of embed it into your culture that, hey, performance is important. If this change is going to be, a regression against performance, then maybe that should be reevaluated. And again, if we can integrate tools like Lighthouse, or maybe you're taking traces yourself, or maybe you're running web page test on a server that's local, but at least plays against sort of what your production environment looks like. You can do that as well. And then over time, your site speeds of the world, where you're actually tracking data of like actual performance in the wild, of like, oh, my curves are, I'm losing front loaded performance because of some XYZ factor. Maybe DNS is slow, or maybe a particular device is giving us trouble. Like you can kind of get down into the nitty gritty. But it's not, I definitely will say that the tooling is pretty easy. Even your, the web hint, which we sort of mentioned at the beginning, that'll sort of lint out and check for certain things that ideally your web setup just shouldn't have. There's some overlap between WebHint and Lighthouse. Lighthouse does more of the deeper performance stuff. WebHint it's more of a linter on that side. But again, you integrate all these sort of pieces to give you a grander puzzle of, wow, this is good. And you want that because at the end of the day, if you're slow, then you're generally losing users left and right.
And now that something like Lighthouse is integrated into Chrome DevTools, there's really no excuse. I used Lighthouse to do some performance testing on my image2 web component, which I've mentioned a few times on the show. And the whole point of that component was to make pages with lots of images render faster, with very little effort. So obviously using something like that to actually verify that it actually was quicker than just standard image elements was really useful. And the fact that I didn't really have to do anything to kind of get that up and running and just run some basic tests and have really nice, well formatted, easy to understand output that just give you some basic numbers which says, yeah, this is faster, this is slower. Obviously, Lighthouse gives you loads more details and there's plenty of numbers I don't understand what they are, but generally it's simple to use. So it's nice to see that.
Yeah, you definitely Lighthouse, given that it's integrated within DevTools now, is like you should play with it. Like if you haven't tried it, run an audit on something and sort of see what it produces, because one, it'll produce actual metric numbers against whether your first meaningful paint is slow, or you've got network requests that are too large. What if you've got an image that didn't get processed in the pipeline correctly and now it's just ginormous? It'll help you there as well. But it also give you sort of best practices and audits, some things that, that sort of progressive nature of what the web is. Like it'll tell you, hey, like you should have, have you considered your, accessibility, and have you done these sorts of things? And a Lighthouse builds on top of other things, like the accessibility stuff is built on Axe. So you get the value of, better accessibility checks that you can sort of continuously dive into. So there's definitely a lot of value in sort of running, at the very least, just run the tool that you have. Like if you've got that thing, run that thing and see exactly where you sit, and then go, oh, I wonder what these things are. And then you can dive in individually and go, I wonder how this particularly works, or I wonder what, what's a critical request chain, right? Like, these are things that a lot of folks may not have heard of. And realistically, how does that, how does a chain deal with the notion of optimizing your rendering? Like how do these things sort of come together? And then again, like a lot of this stuff is not, I'm not going to say it's necessarily intuitive. Once you sort of get the hang of it, you start to understand pieces of it like anything else. So it can be, it's all learned. Like you don't be afraid of performance testing. It's right there. It's right there for the taking.
Do you know if there's any other browsers which have any similar tools kind of integrated, or is Chrome the only one that's actually kind of got this far at the moment?
From a Lighthouse perspective, I believe Chrome is the only one that'll run audits right now. Now, that may change over time. Would be sort of my, well, maybe that's my pie in the side dream. Primarily as sort of things like the DevTools protocol ideally gets sorted out into a more standardsy compliant way. Because the one thing to keep in mind too is that they're all browsers and they render things, but they don't necessarily render things all the same way, right? The render pipelines are different. So you do have to, like, again, like it should give you a leap point into this is the way my thing performs. And again, you can run tracing in pretty much anything. So there's no reason you can't go into Firefox and say, I'm going to run my own performance trace against this and start to see, is it going to be the same thing? Am I looking for those same sort of things? To some extent, probably, like from a code perspective. From that makes the browser slow in this case. That's, maybe I don't want to do that. A good example of this was the nature of CSS transforms, right? For a long time, we all sort of knew, that not all transforms were created equal in terms of the way they made things paint. So, jumping things around left and right could be done in, similarly performant ways as opposed to sort of the non-performant ways. And so, again, that was sort of something that everyone learned over time. And now you don't see sort of the terribleness of a lot of those things anymore. Performance testing in that regard is very similar. So, we're slowly moving that way. And it's important because site speed, if your site is slow, users leave. And if your site is slow, the way things index now on the web, Google and your Bings of the world want faster sites. Like if you're slow and you're not rendering stuff quickly, then why should I show you to a user? So you can't take it for granted. I think people, again, they make assumptions as to who their target audience is. And once you start making that assumption, that's fine if you need a leap point, but do a little research. Or if you've got analytics, take a look at your analytics and see where people are coming from. And then at the end of the day, track your performance metrics. If you can do that, you're going to be better off overall.
Yeah. So we've mentioned lots of benefits or lots of reasons why you should care about performance testing. Have you got any tips for selling it to the business? And by that I mean, if you're not in charge of a project, but you know that performance testing is important, what's some kind of good ways to say, we need to have the time to be able to do these kind of things and fix these issues? Have you got any tips on doing that?
Yeah, I think that the key thing is that ideally, you have to focus at the end user, because at the end of the day, when it comes to sort of the business case for most things, really the thing that you end up selling or the thing that you're delivering to end users is the place where the conversation about performance often comes up, because a lot of times people will say, we're not getting enough clicks on this button that we put in, and the A/B test isn't showing us much better results in either or. Like it's just not very good. And then but the design folks say that it's it's clearly a very good design in either case, and it should be converting. Why isn't it converting? And a lot of times, if you dig down through sort of the whys of that, you might find yourself having performance regression somewhere there, right? And a lot of times that's when you're bringing forth, they're going, well, the reason they don't click on it is because that button doesn't render for 10 seconds after, the page doesn't load. And a lot of time, and you can see to some extent the value in that within stuff that, is you look at things like AMP, right, which I realize is a sort of a loaded word depending on who you talk to sort of AMP about. But AMP sort of had a very somewhat a very strict performance targeted sort of thing that sort of said, hey, people in particular industries who are trying to serve ads and things, you can do better if you do this. And oh, look, that was true. Like, performance did render better results across the board. So performance, it's a lot of times you can take those case studies and run with them and say, this is why performance is important. And a lot of times the analytics will tell you the story too. Like if you're looking at bounce rates, or if you're looking at and even some of those analytics admittedly will lie to you, because what if they never load the analytics because your site is too slow? That happens too. So you really, you really have to be cognizant of these things.
Doesn't Google Analytics specifically give you a lot of insight into page speed for particular users as well, and those kind of things? Like, does it give you like average load times and that kind of stuff? Is that a thing?
Yeah, it does have some performance tracking in there. You can sort of there's a few articles out there too of how to push more sort of perf numbers into analytics. There's a lot of tools out there that will track this sort of stuff for you. In terms of monitoring how your page sort of performs over time with end users.
And even without setting anything up, like some of those statistics can be like a starting point. If you see a particular page or a particular part of the application is slower than others, then maybe you could start looking there with some of these performance tools that you've mentioned here.
Yeah, and again, it's a bit of a rabbit hole. There are lots of different ones out there. I won't make any claim to any specific one as being the magic bullet, because I don't think they are. I don't think, admittedly, I don't think anyone claims to be. They're all just trying to make generally the notion of the user experience better by giving you some metrics against that very thing to sort of track. And that starts at different levels, like you said, right? You're starting at what tool do I have in my workbox right now? Well, I've got Lighthouse and Chrome. I can use that one. Okay, great. Well, I want to test real world network perf. All right. Okay. Well, I got web page test, and it'll actually give me, low performance on a G4 or whatever that device is. Okay. Well, now I've got to, I really want to hone down my JavaScript. Well, I can trace and put that on against a mobile device that's on my desk, so I can really hone down that, my boot time in my JavaScript, or what that thread is doing at the start. And then, okay, great, I've deployed that thing. Now I'm sort of tracking that metric against analytics or some other collector that says, oh, great, okay, I see that I've got some regression in my speed index, or I'm getting, slower paint times than normal. Why is that? Okay, well, we can go track that down. And then again, like you said, it requires a business case. The business case is there now. Like if you're not getting faster now,
especially with the search indexing changes, the things we learned in the SEO episode about, how it's a major ranking factor, speed. I mean, that's a huge business case, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're to not, and I've seen pushback, like people cling to the notion that I don't have to be fast because of X. Like, I hear that one a lot. I don't have to be fast because I'm only delivering for this subsegment of people. And I see this in internal networks too, where people are like, well, it's an internal app. I don't need it. I don't need it to be fast. It just has to serve. And I'm like, yeah, but if your users take X amount of time every day because your infrastructure is slow, like you are losing potential there, right? You're losing potential, whatever your end user output might be, whether it's sales or production of a unit or something.
Yeah.
So you have to take those things into account. And if this is no different than a lot of the when your position starts to become somewhat what's the word, I suppose, sort of phonetic, like you're very encased in the thing that you're using. So maybe that's a framework, or maybe that's an approach, and you don't take a lot of insight outside of that thing because you say this is the only one way to do it. I see people get stuck in that a lot too. And the problem with that is that once you get stuck in that, not only does performance go out the window, like pretty much everything does. Like you have to be willing to look beyond just well, I've always done it this way and this is the way it's going to be. Because once you're stuck there, like it's not a good day for your performance. It's probably not a good day for your users either. And that means that someone else might come and take your users with a better performing thing.
I think another thing, I think a lot of developers can get, myself included, you get kind of stuck in the trap of, you're writing a piece of code, and of course you want that to be the best, most performant piece of code in the world. So you spend time thinking, right, this is going to be super efficient, and you spend an extra hour making something perfectly optimized, and you only use libraries that are less than 1K and all those other kind of things. But none of that kind of matters if you're not using these tools to kind of prove that it's making a difference. It's like, why bother? If you're spending the time to do those things, to make it fast, to make it, download less bytes to the browser and all those other kind of things, then you're not using the tools to kind of back up the fact that you've done that, then, it doesn't make much sense. So you can use these tools to really show that hard work is paying off.
Trace more. Yeah, I would always trace more things. Like if you're making changes and trying to make, if you're trying to guess, like there's no reason to guess. Like you can sit there and spin it up in DevTools and say, hey, let's just trace this and see what exactly it does. Like I can,
in like 3 clicks.
Yeah, in like 3 clicks. Yeah, I mean, this doesn't take a massive amount of time. I mean, it probably will take you, the 3 clicks will probably take you less time than it took to run your bundle, depending on what your bundle looks like. In which case, you again, like the kicker is that there are so many layers to this. Like, if you're running a build tool and it's bundling stuff, then yeah, make sure that the thing that it's spitting out, make sure you have performance target budgets in there. Addy wrote a really great post about, these are, what JavaScript does against your main thread. And like, you should have, bundle targets and script size and everything else that you want. Like, again, like pick the place that's easiest for you to get started. Like as the developer, and for most of us, that's going to be the tools that are in your browser because you have to run it there anyhow. If you're not there, then great. Okay, you're just running code or writing code rather. Great. Look at your bundle. If you're using Webpack, how are you using Webpack? Are you looking at, the additional resources? Are you tree shaking? Are you getting rid of the things that you don't need that will fundamentally just not make your user experience better? Ship less code. And then trace that less code to make sure that it is indeed doing what you want it to do. It'll just make your life better. Like it generally will, because people, we talk about users and they're like, well, it's hard to test. I'm like, if it's faster, it shouldn't be that much harder to test. Because there's nothing worse than sitting on a component that takes 60 seconds to render as you're trying to test bug fix 2.
Yeah,
that's, if you're in some app and you're going, man, I wish this rendered faster, that's probably a sign that performance testing is in your future. I'm just saying.
So for people who are kind of just getting started or looking at wanting to do some performance testing, is there any good online resources or websites that people can go to kind of get started in all of this? Is there any particular places that you could recommend?
So I definitely would say if you're looking to sort of hear the more fundamental web performance reasons, definitely check developers.google.com/web/fundamentals, because there's an entire section on performance there that just talks generally to some extent about why performance is important and what sort of benefits it brings to you. So if you're looking for more of that base case of things, that's a really nice place to start. There are a lot of tools and sites out there that are collecting sort of articles of things, of which we'll put some in the show notes. But, there's a lot of work currently being done on this in terms of the way tools are being made, the way we as developers sort of look at the frameworks and things that we use to bring the web forward, and the way that those testing solutions, which used to be very piecemeal, have become significantly easier to run, with less overhead for not just the company with the big CIs and all the infrastructure
Yeah.
Most of the stuff you can run today. Open your web browser, go to web page test, fire up Lighthouse in Chrome, go to webhint, use it as an npm script, or use it as you can install it via npm. A lot of these things, they're easy to get started. They don't take a great amount of time, and because of that low friction, you should have less of an excuse to at least take that initial look and ask yourself the question. And then if you need more information, there's more out there, and we'll make sure to put a whole bunch of show links in so that
that'd be nice.
Because
cool.
I know you're using some of them. I use them all the time for making things. Basically, paint. Some days painting is as good as I can get, Leon. It's just paint today.
Wow. Cool. Well, this has been really useful, I think. Performance testing on the front end, it's such a big topic, like you said, and there's lots of stuff out there. It can be very difficult to get an idea of where to start. So I think this episode has kind of gone through some of the some of your favorite tools that are easier to get started with. So I think that's been really useful. Is there anything that we've forgotten to mention that you'd like to kind of fit in here? Obviously, with the topic being so big, I'm sure there is plenty of things, but is there anything else we'd like to mention before we?
It's such a big topic, that I would love if you're following us on Twitter, definitely ping us with the tools that you're using to test performance, or if you're not using tools, tell us why you're not using performance tools. Like, I think I'd be very interested to know how listeners out there are using it, or if they're using a particular tool or don't quite understand what some of that metrics numbers mean, because I think we all agree sometimes it's a very deep dive in some cases. Like, let us know, and that way maybe we can talk about this more, and we'll go find someone who can tell us the nitty-gritty of exactly why things render the way they do. So definitely let us know on Twitter. I think
that sounds really good.
Well, fantastic, Leon. Thank you for another great show.
Thank you, Justin.
Danny had to run and fix staging. So
Poor Danny.
Poor Danny. But this has been episode number 170 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today we've been talking about performance on the front end, testing tools, why performance is important. It's such a large topic. We hope you just got a little taste of it. So next week, tune in for more web platform, more web things, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.